Reika suddenly bolted upright, gasping in agony as he clawed at the dirt. He was bewildered and overwhelmed by pain, unable to comprehend how he was breathing when he knew for a fact that he had already died. From the sidelines, a man with slick-back hair and a mocking grin watched the scene unfold. He leaned back casually, clutching a book in one hand, and let out a cold laugh at Reika's confusion. With a condescending tone, he interrupted Reika's panic to let him know that he had a few questions he wanted to ask. Reika looked up in terror, his voice trembling as he demanded to know who this stranger was. He remained sprawled in the dirt, dwarfed by the massive, circular rim of the pit that surrounded them. The man, with his sharp features, long earrings, and a smug expression, simply clasped his hands together in a mock gesture of prayer. He answered with a playful air, admitting that he was the one who had called Reika back from the dead. Reika looked down at his chest in disbelief, touching the spot where the fatal blow had landed. The wound was completely gone, leaving his skin smooth and unmarked, as if he had never been struck at all. Overwhelmed by a mix of suspicion and hope, Reika looked back at the slick-back man. He asked softly if this stranger truly was the one who had saved him, and if he had extended that same mercy to the other children as well. The man simply maintained his enigmatic, confident smile, watching Reika with a look of quiet satisfaction. The man's expression shifted, his smile turning cold and dismissive. He bluntly informed Reika that he had only saved him and no one else. Stunned and horrified, Reika scrambled to his feet, demanding to know where the other children were and why they weren't with him. He looked around the desolate landscape, his panic rising as he realized he was alone in the vast, open space. The man didn't even look up, simply gesturing vaguely toward the edge of the pit. He told Reika that the children were still right there, pointing toward the depth where the others remained. The man explained his reasoning with a chilling level of detachment. He described how he had carefully selected which parts of the other children to use to fix Reika, mentioning that the larger child's legs had been used to repair Reika's own, while the organs of an infant were used to mend his internals. As he spoke, he maintained a bright, unsettlingly cheerful smile, seemingly proud of his handiwork. He complimented Reika on his new, sturdy build, noting that the boy now looked quite impressive. He chuckled to himself, wondering why Reika looked so distressed when he should be grateful for such a perfect restoration. Driven by a sudden explosion of rage and horror, Reika lunged forward. He screamed at the man, demanding to know exactly what he had just said, his face twisted in grief and fury. The man didn't even flinch. With an expression of bored indifference, he effortlessly dodged Reika's desperate attack. As Reika stumbled past, the man simply looked on, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the boy's emotional collapse. The man leaned in close to Reika, his wide eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity and his grin stretching across his face. He mocked Reika's emotional distress, questioning why he was so concerned for others when he had been given the gift of life. With a sudden, blurring motion, the man gripped Reika's wrist and twisted it. He laughed coldly, reminding Reika that he was now an indentured servant who owed his very existence to his savior. He told the boy that he should be focused on gratitude rather than grief, especially since his new body was constructed from the remains of those Reika had cared for. In a sudden, violent motion, the man shattered the knife Reika had been holding, the blade exploding into countless fragments. Reika stared at the ruins of the weapon in shock, unable to believe how quickly it had been destroyed. The man didn't stop there. With a terrifying burst of speed, he lunged forward, his arm blurring as he delivered a crushing blow. As he revealed his weapon, a long, sturdy strip of cloth that he handled with ease. He explained with a smug grin that he had infused the fabric with souls, turning a simple piece of cloth into something far more dangerous. Reika struggled desperately, pulling against the binding, but the material wouldn't budge. He gasped in shock, realizing the cloth was as rigid and unbreakable as steel. Leaning in with a wide, manic look in his eyes, the man mocked Reika's helplessness. He had initially brought the boy back because he needed a guide, but his priorities had shifted. He admitted that now that he was feeling inspired, he found the idea of tormenting a walking corpse far more entertaining. Defeated and broken, Reika slumped forward, his spirit crushed under the weight of the man's cruelty. He whispered that he finally understood, promising that he would no longer resist or fight against his captor. The man looked on with a smug, half-lidded expression of victory. He seemed pleased that Reika had finally accepted his place as a servant, noting to himself that everyone eventually ends up begging for their life in the end. However, the moment of submission was interrupting the scene with an abrupt shout. He looked at the man with a gaze of pure defiance, telling him that he had already heard enough and demanding that the man stop his theatrical performance. The spiky-haired young man stepped closer, his expression unreadable as he spoke in a dry, mocking tone. He told the man that he actually seemed like a good person at heart. He explained his reasoning with a strange intensity, claiming that he could smell milk coming from the man's advertising banner. The youth suggested that the man must have once fed a newborn baby, implying that such an act of kindness proved there was some shred of humanity left within him. As the youth continued, he mused that even if it was a small gesture, it meant the man wasn't entirely devoid of a human soul. He looked the man in the eye, asking with a smirk if he was correct in his assessment. The man's expression shifted from smugness to a wide, manic grin. He chuckled, dismissing the youth's theory with a laugh. He admitted that while he might have performed such an act, it wasn't out of kindness. Instead, he described himself as a pervert with a specific taste for the milk of newborns. The spiky-haired youth's face fell into a look of pure disgust at the revelation. Before he could react further, he was interrupted by a group of children emerging from the shadows. A young girl, holding a traditional parasol and wearing a light-colored robe, called out in excitement, shouting for uncle as she spotted them. The children rushed forward, their faces lighting up with joy. As they reached the group, one of them pointed toward Reika, shouting with glee that he had finally woken up. The spiky-haired youth looked on with a bewildered expression, while the man watched the reunion with a look of amused curiosity. The man dismissed the tension with a wave of his hand, laughing off his previous cruelty as a mere joke. He chuckled at Reika's indignation, telling the boy to stop complaining and follow along. The children crowded around, their innocence contrasting sharply with the dark atmosphere. Some asked why the man had been saying such strange things, prompting the youth to tell them to trust him, claiming he was the one who had actually saved them. The man watched the youth with a calculating gaze, noting that the boy possessed both intelligence and a certain boldness. He admitted he had tested the youth a bit, though his smile remained predatory. As they walked, the spiky-haired youth began to analyze the man's abilities. He recalled the man mentioning that he had infused souls into his cloth, recognizing it as a form of soul manipulation technique. He mused that while he had heard of techniques to manipulate the dead, the Quang Thai, he had never heard of a technique that could actually bring a dead person back to life. He wondered if the man was some sort of renowned master of the soul arts. The man continued to brag, claiming that performing a resurrection required a level of skill and mastery that few could ever hope to achieve. He looked down on the others with a smug air of superiority, confident in his own genius. Watching this with a skeptical expression, he asked bluntly who the man actually was, asking for his identity as well. He responded with a formal, almost stiff politeness, suggesting that it would be proper for him to introduce himself first. He revealed his name to be Reika. He looked somewhat uncertain when asked about his hometown, admitting that he didn't actually know where he was born. Reika explained that he believed he belonged to the people of Dong-A, but those who had captured them were from the northern nation of Bak-Kak. As he spoke, he maintained a calm but guarded posture, his dark eyes scanning the strange man who had played with Reika's life. The man finally introduced himself, revealing his name as Baku Ruru. With a smug look and a sharp glint in his eye, he told Reika that he didn't know where he was born either, noting that they were similar in that regard. Baku then explained his current occupation, stating that he was on a hunt for half-beasts. He described his profession as that of a Tain Enhan, a term that sounded more like something from a fairy tale than a reality. Reika looked skeptical, questioning if this Tain Enhan was some sort of mythical being from a storybook. However, Baku confirmed it with a confident grin. He spoke of the world outside, explaining that beyond their current confines, there are creatures and monsters that far exceed human understanding and comprehension. Baku Ruru expanded on his explanation, describing a world teeming with monsters that conventional weapons could not hope to scratch. He explained that only soul arts, the specialized techniques used by the Tain Enhan, were effective against such threats. He painted a picture of the Tine Enhan as silent protectors, operating from the shadows to shield humanity from these horrors. However, he admitted that this noble calling had a dark side. Some of their own kind had become corrupted, turning their mastery of the soul into a tool for cruelty. Baku warned that there were those who had mutated into monstrosities themselves, using their power to prey on the innocent. He spoke with a grim intensity, revealing that some had even begun treating ordinary humans as mere playthings or experimental subjects for their twisted curiosities, turning the art of protection into a game of sadistic pleasure. Reika looked at Baku Ruru with a confused expression, questioning why the man was suddenly rambling about monsters and protectors when it had nothing to do with their current situation. Baku's demeanor shifted, his playfulness replaced by a sudden, sharp intensity. He revealed that there was one specific person Reika should be concerned about, Kaiwu Enku, a high-ranking official of the northern nation, Bak Kak. He explained that Kaiwu Enku was a fallen Tine Enhan who had completely succumbed to corruption, turning his soul arts into a weapon of mass destruction. Baku's voice grew grim as he described the horror of Kaiwu Enku's existence, noting that while the man's name was known, his true power and nature remained a terrifying mystery. He stated bluntly that his primary mission was to kill this monster. Suddenly, Baku looked back at Reika, his expression returning to a smug, knowing smile. He asked if the youth had a reason for wanting to follow him, suggesting that Reika might be seeking something specific from him. Reika remained silent, his gaze hardening as he contemplated the dangerous world Baku had just described. Baku Ruru decided there was no longer a need to question Reika's motives. With a sudden, enigmatic command, he told the youth to go inside. Reika looked completely bewildered, his eyes wide with confusion as he asked what on earth that was supposed to mean. Baku corrected him with a sly smile, explaining that he wasn't talking about a physical location, but rather that he intended to put a part of his own soul inside Reika. Baku began to explain the mechanics of this process, noting that while a foreign soul is typically rejected by a human body, he had a way to bypass that. He described how he could enter Reika's consciousness through the visual sense, essentially seeing through the youth's eyes. He explained that this would allow him to perceive everything Reika saw, including things that were normally invisible to the human eye. As he spoke, Baku's expression turned slightly more serious. He admitted that this process was a burden, as the host would be forced to witness fragmented, haunting memories of the soul entering them. Despite the mental toll, he insisted it was necessary, leaving Reika to contemplate the strange and intrusive bond he was about to share with the man. Despite his hesitation, Reika gave in and told Baku Ruru to go ahead and perform the procedure. Baku's expression became focused as he guided Reika's gaze. He instructed the youth to look closely into the narrow gap between his two middle fingers, his voice commanding and precise. As Reika leaned in, Baku's eyes seemed to sharpen, preparing to bridge the gap between their consciousnesses. As Reika stared intently into the space Baku indicated, a strange, eye-like portal manifested within the gap of the fingers. The void pulsed with an otherworldly energy, drawing Reika in. With a final, whispered command to look deeper, the boundary between them vanished and the process of the soul transfer began. As Reika stared into the void, the world around him dissolved. He was suddenly plunged into a fragmented vision, seeing the solemn face of a man with long, flowing hair and deep, sorrowful eyes. The man looked at him with an expression of quiet resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The scene shifted violently, and Reika found himself standing in the center of a vast, desolate wasteland. He was surrounded by a sea of people, hundreds of hollow-eyed survivors of Dong-A, standing in a silent, oppressive crowd. The silence was shattered by a series of booming commands echoing across the field, ordering the masses to halt their march. Reika stood frozen, a small figure amidst the tide of displaced souls, feeling the crushing weight of a memory that didn't belong to him. Reika gasped, realizing that the vision he was experiencing was a mirrored reflection of the events from the previous night. He watched man looked out over the landscape, remarking on how magnificent the sight was. The memory sharpened, revealing the true scale of the tragedy. Reika saw himself within the vision. Standing among the displaced people of Dong-A, he looked around at the weary faces of his compatriots, men and women with hollow expressions and tattered clothing, all huddled together in fear and exhaustion. The vision lingered on the broken people, their eyes reflecting a profound sense of loss. Reika felt the collective grief of the crowd wash over him, realizing that every single person he saw had been stripped of their dignity and hope. Baku Ruru's voice echoed in Reika's mind, explaining that the images he was seeing were merely fragmented reflections of Reika's own memories. He described them as damaged images, shards of the past being reconstructed through the soul bond. Within the vision, the cruelty of the northern nation became clear. Reika watched as the survivors of Dong-A were forced to stand in rigid formation, spaced exactly 10 paces apart. This calculated distance was a command designed specifically to prevent them from speaking or comforting one another, stripping away the last remnants of their community. The memory shifted to a moment of sudden, suffocating silence. The chaotic noise of the crowd vanished instantly, replaced by a chilling stillness. Reika felt a surge of dread as the reason for the silence became clear. Someone had arrived. The atmosphere grew heavy with terror as the figure of Kaiwu Enku finally appeared. Kaiwu Enku appeared, a figure of chilling poise and elegance. He possessed long, wavy hair that framed a face defined by a thin, confident smile and sharp, calculating eyes. Mounted atop a powerful horse, he looked down upon the captives from a position of absolute authority, his ornate attire marking him as a man of high status and dangerous power. Reika, witnessing this through the memory, felt a wave of instinctive terror. He stared up at the man, his expression one of sheer panic and disbelief. The memory then flickered with a sudden, violent shift. He crashed into the dirt, while the distant figure of Kaiwu Enku remained unmoved, watching the carnage with a detached, almost bored curiosity. Reika's memory flared with a chaotic scene of desperation. He saw himself again, his face twisted in a frantic shout as he urged the crowd of captives to get down on the ground immediately. He knew that staying upright made them easy targets, and he screamed that if they remained standing, every single one of them would be killed. Despite his warnings, many remained frozen in fear. Amidst the panic, Reika's eyes locked onto a woman with long, dark hair tied back, her expression one of exhausted sorrow. She clutched a small infant tightly to her chest, her gaze distant and hollow, seemingly numb to the horror unfolding around them. Reika stared at her and the child, his expression a mixture of desperation and helplessness as he realized he might not be able to save everyone. The vision shifted violently as Reika realized the terrifying distance between himself and the enemy. He stared in horror, calculating the gap and realizing it was only a few paces, far too close for safety. In a blur of motion, Kaiwu Enku struck. A massive, powerful hand lunged forward with blinding speed, catching Reika completely off guard. Before the youth could even raise his arms in defense, the blow connected with devastating force. The impact was brutal, slamming Reika's body backward. He was thrown through the air like a rag doll, his expression one of pure shock as he was crushed into the earth. In the background, the woman and her infant remained frozen, witnesses to the casual brutality Kaiwu Enku used to quell any hope of resistance. He looked up, dazed, and saw the figures around him. The images of the past and present blurred for a moment, the silhouette of the people standing nearby mirroring the captives from his memory. His breathing remained ragged as he stared blankly ahead, the phantom pain of Kaiwu Enku's strike still echoing through his body. He was left trembling in the dust, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the horror that Baku Ruru had just forced him to remember. As Reika lay there trembling, his mind continued to churn, obsessing over the sheer power he had witnessed. He couldn't wrap his head around it. How could a single person possess such overwhelming strength? He wondered what kind of monster Kaiwu Enku truly was. Within the lingering fragments of the memory, the truth of the attack became clearer. Kaiwu Enku hadn't simply used physical force. He had infused a soul into the very wind itself, imbuing the air with a lethal, cutting intent. The vision culminated in a terrifying close-up of Kaiwu Enku's cold, piercing eye. The man's voice echoed through the memory, a chilling command that sealed the fate of the captives. He ordered the wind to tear everything in its path in half. The memory shifted to a heart-wrenching scene. Reika saw the woman with the infant lying motionless in the dirt, her eyes staring blankly into the void. A hand reached down to touch her forehead, confirming the cold reality of her death. Reflecting on the attack, Reika realized the calculated nature of the massacre. Kai Wu had precisely adjusted the path of his soul-infused wind, ensuring it struck with surgical precision. He hadn't intended to kill everyone. Instead, he had deliberately spared a few survivors. As Reika looked over the field of corpses, the horrifying reason for this mercy became clear. Kai Wu hadn't saved the survivors out of compassion, but rather to prepare a feast for someone else. He had left the children and the wounded alive specifically to serve as living prey for the horrors that were soon to follow. The nightmare reached its peak as a grotesque creature emerged from the carnage. A mass of twisted flesh and blackened, tentacle-like limbs erupted, sprawling across the field of corpses like a living shadow. Reika watched in horror as the creature loomed over the survivors. The monster was the result of the feast Kai Wu had promised, a manifestation of soul arts gone wrong. Gazing at the monstrosity, he felt a wave of nausea. He wondered how a human being could be stripped of their humanity so completely, transformed into such a wretched, mindless thing for the amusement of a madman. Baku Ruru stood over the recovering Reika, his expression one of mock pity. He mused aloud, commenting on what a truly miserable tragedy Reika's past had been, his voice dripping with a cruel kind of curiosity. He looked toward the memory of the monstrous creature, explaining that the beast had become so distorted and twisted because it had been born from shock and an overwhelming amount of hatred. Baku suggested that this was the natural result of such intense suffering. With a sudden, jarring movement, Kaio leaned his face, his wide, manic eyes swirling with intensity, and a wide, unsettling grin stretching across his lips. From a distance, Baku Ruru stood with his back to Reika, staring out over the horizon. As he watched, he realized that the memories Reika had experienced weren't actually organic recollections of the past. Instead, they were automatic portals, shards of soul energy created from the intense emotions of the dead. Baku's expression grew sharp as he connected the dots. He realized that on that fateful night, someone had used a specialized technique to plant one of these soul portals directly into Reika's eyes. It was the exact same method Baku had just used to link their minds. A grim realization settled over Baku. He mused that whoever had done this was likely another Tyne Enhan, someone who had hidden a trace of themselves inside the boy. He stared intensely at Reika, wondering who this mysterious individual was and why they had chosen Reika as their vessel. Baku suddenly senses that Reika is in danger and calls out his name. Meanwhile, Reika kneels down, grips a large rock with both hands and crushes it with desperate force, sweating and straining as if trying to activate an ability or respond to Baku's warning. Surrounded by the corpses, Reika realizes they are not illusions but the actual bodies of the people who died here. Though he knows reviving them is impossible, he refuses to abandon their remains, desperately clutching the stone as he resolves not to leave them behind. As Reika remains fixated on the fallen bodies, Kaio, his grotesque, many-eyed form looming overhead, raises his sword and prepares a killing strike. Baku senses the imminent danger and desperately shouts Reika's name, but Reika is too distracted by his grief to react as the blade comes crashing down. Kaio-U's devastating slash crashes into the ground, erupting in a massive shockwave that tears across the battlefield. Watching from afar, Baku freezes in tense silence, his eyes fixed on the explosion as he anxiously waits to see whether Reika survived the attack. The earth-shattering slash carved through the battlefield, but when the dust and torrents of force settled, Reika was still standing. It wasn't fear of Kaio-U's overwhelming attack or panic over his own life that had frozen him in place. Rather, by sheer resolve, he had endured the impossible, refusing to abandon the fallen even in the face of certain death. Baku stared in utter disbelief. He knew the lethal potency of the attack and the crushing weight of the earth that had collapsed. By all laws of nature, the boy should have been obliterated. Instead, Reika remained standing, alive, and physically intact in a way that defied all logic. Baku Ruru stood paralyzed, his mind racing as he tried to rationalize what he had just seen. He knew Reika was just an ordinary boy, completely ignorant of the soul arts, with no training or innate power to survive such a catastrophe. As he watched Reika, Baku realized that the boy wasn't just lucky. Something had intervened. He mused that in a world where the strength of the soul determines everything, there had to be a logical explanation, even if it defied the known laws of the Tyne Enhan. Baku began to theorize that perhaps a soul more powerful than a human's had merged with Reika, granting him a physical resilience that shouldn't exist. He wondered if the mysterious person who had planted the soul portal in Reika's eyes had also left behind a protective force to ensure the boy's survival. Looking at Reika, Baku's expression shifted from shock to a grim, focused curiosity. He realized that if Reika truly possessed such a power, the boy was no longer just a guide or a curious specimen. He was something far more significant and dangerous. Reika's overwhelming soul force erupted beyond all reason, shaking even Kyowu and Ku. Tears streaming down his face, Reika declared, "Get out of my mind!" The command carried the absolute authority of the realm itself, leaving Kyowu and Ku stunned as he realized the boy's awakened had surpassed every limit he thought possible. Reika stood his ground, tears streaming down his face as Kyowu and Ku charged forward in a desperate attempt to reclaim control. The grotesque, multi-eyed creature loomed over Reika, its massive, gaping maw opening wide to swallow him whole. The monster's form was a chaotic swirl of darkness and staring eyes, an embodiment of the horror Reika had just witnessed in his visions. Baku-Ruru watched from the side, his face twisted in a mix of desperation and intensity. Instead of pulling Reika away, he screamed at the top of his lungs, urging the boy to stop thinking with his head and instead give a direct command. Baku realized that the terrifying power swirling around Reika was a tool that could be wielded. He roared for Reika to take control and command the soul, residing within him, believing that this was the only way the youth could survive the onslaught of the monster. Driven by Baku's screams and his own desperation, Reika let out a guttural roar. He slammed his hand against his chest, forcing his will into the core of the strange power surging through him. In an instant, a blinding flash of energy erupted from his body, striking out with the force of a physical blow. The attack was devastating. The multi-eyed monstrosity was caught square in the chest, the sheer impact folding its massive body in half. The creature was sent flying backward, its form buckling as it was blasted away by the raw, untamed strength of the youth. The impact was catastrophic, sending the multi-eyed beast reeling through the air in a violent arc. Its massive, distorted body twisted as it was propelled backward by the sheer force of Reika's outburst. Baku-Ruru watched from the side, his face pale and his expression one of sheer awe. He stared at the wreckage of the monster, unable to believe that such an overwhelming blow had come from someone who had just been a trembling boy moments ago. Standing in the center of a massive crater of light, Reika looked small but resolute. He stood amidst the radiating energy of the blast, a single figure of defiance against the darkness that had tried to consume him. With a final, guttural scream of defiance, Reika unleashed everything he had. He roared for the intrusive presence to vanish from his mind immediately, his voice echoing with a power that felt larger than his own body. A colossal sphere of white light exploded around him, a blinding supernova that incinerated the surrounding darkness. The shockwave was so immense that it shattered the landscape, obliterating the remaining debris and pushing everything back in a tidal wave of purity. As the blinding light began to recede, Reika stood breathless and spent in the center of the silence. Baku-Ruru watched him, his expression softening with a hint of sadness. He realized that the link between them had been severed. The energy that had bound them was gone. With a quiet sigh, he accepted that his time with the boy had come to an end, and it was time for him to depart. Baku-Ruru stood a short distance away, his expression unusually soft. He looked at the exhausted youth and quietly thanked him, acknowledging the strength Reika had shown. Reika looked back at the man, feeling a strange sense of closure. He admitted that even if the experience had been nothing more than a dream, he felt significantly lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his soul. As Baku prepared to leave, Reika found himself lingering on a thought. He wondered if it was even possible for him to become a strong man like the one he had seen, the mysterious presence that had protected him. He looked at the horizon, a newfound determination flickering in his eyes, wishing he had encountered such a mentor much sooner in his life. Baku-Ruru paused, his gaze turning distant and contemplative. He wondered aloud if he could tell Reika something truly valuable, something of worth before he departed. His expression darkened as he reflected on his own journey. He recalled the grueling path he had taken to train as a Tine Enhan, musing on the countless sacrifices and the sheer willpower it had required to master the soul arts. He admitted that almost everything he had once craved, the power, the strength, the status, now felt empty, having vanished like mist over time. Despite his cynicism, his thoughts returned to the youth. He whispered Reika's name to himself, his voice carrying a hint of genuine interest. He looked back at the boy, seeing not just a survivor, but a potential that defied the logic of the world he knew. Bakururu looked at Reika with a knowing smile, asking the boy if he still truly desired to become a strong man, a Tain Enhan, despite everything he had just experienced. He seemed to be testing the youth's resolve one last time. Reika didn't hesitate. He collapsed to his knees, his expression one of absolute conviction and desperation. With a powerful shout, he declared his desire to become exactly like that, pleading for the chance to gain the strength necessary to change his fate. Baku stood over him, his long coat draped elegantly over his frame as he looked down at the kneeling boy. The air between them grew heavy with anticipation, the seed of a new purpose finally taking root in Reika's heart. Bakururu looked down at Reika with a sharp, knowing glint in his eyes, warning the boy not to misunderstand. He told Reika bluntly that he wasn't taking him on as a disciple because of any innate talent or special gift. He seemed almost amused by Reika's confusion, questioning if the youth truly didn't realize what he had just done. Baku leaned back, his posture relaxed yet dominant, as he reminded Reika of a promise he had previously mentioned. He stated that Reika was the only person he ever intended to save. Then Baku's gaze shifted toward the other children. He pointed out that every single one of them had survived, including the newborn baby, solely because of Reika's actions. As the children crowded around, their faces filled with relief and gratitude, Reika stared at them in shock, finally understanding that his desperate struggle had saved the only family he had left. Bakururu looked at the youth with a rare softness in his expression. He told Reika that he had done something truly wonderful, acknowledging the boy's strength and spirit in a way that left Reika wide-eyed and speechless. With a smug, confident grin, Baku told the boy to start looking up to him as a role model. He warned Reika that the training ahead would be incredibly harsh and grueling, leaving no room for laziness or sleep. As the two began to walk away together, Baku mused that he and Reika were now partners in a dangerous journey. Together, they stepped forward into the unknown, bound by a master-disciple relationship born from tragedy and an unlikely spark of hope. If you like the story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe so that I can keep bringing more such stories for you to enjoy.